Hello and welcome to the Six Sigma Greenbelt training here at the Seattle Lighthouse.
So we'll get started. So again, what we're going to go through, a review agenda, is Pareto charting, process mapping, and crime scene mapping. We'll kind of do a review of strategic planning, or the Hoshin Planning, and again look at ABC, PQPR analyses, look at what those are. Again, talk a little bit about a bell curve and standard deviation. I have introduced a little bit new material in there to kind of help explain, I'm hoping explain a little better, the mathematics about what a standard deviation is, or what Six Sigma really is. We'll go into the ranked pairs tool a little bit, which is what you guys used when we did one of the times before we were using the catapults, and I had you guys kind of play around with that ranked pairs tool. Cause and effect diagram, which is what I have here, also known as, yay, old path. We're going to shoot catapults again a little. Now, after we do the cause and effect diagram, catapult exercise, and then we're going to go into the input-output matrix, and that'll be a live simulation that we'll throw up on the screen, and I'll have you guys kind of walk through that. So again, Pareto chart is not just a bar chart. It's actually displaying segmented data from high impact to low impact, but it being Pareto is the 80-20 rule. So this is a nice little bar chart. I'm showing my categories from my highest impact to my lowest impact, but it's not a true Pareto until I have that cumulative percentage showing me at what point am I covering 80% of my issues. So regardless of bar chart, pie chart, what they call a run chart, which is just the lines with the dots, the dotted lines, a high dot and a low dot, there's all these different charts. As soon as you draw a line anywhere and say this segment covers 80% of my issue, now it's a Pareto analysis. So some of the projects I'm going to be handing out to you guys, unless you've got one on your own that you've already come up with. I've got quite a few projects coming up here in the near future that I think would fit really well. Is I'll ask you guys to do, like say, hey, build me a Pareto analysis with this data. I hand you the data and make a nice little bar chart out of it, sort it from high to low, but then show me where the 80% is. So at times, you're going to do some analysis, you're going to run a Pareto analysis, and it'll be kind of flat like this. And you're not going to get to your 80% until you're almost at the very end. So when you run into that, again, that's usually because you haven't sliced the data quite right. You might not have your categories, not that there's any issue with the math or anything around it, it's just the way you're looking at the data is not the right way to sort it. So instances like this have come up where we said, well, let's look at all the issues that came out of the shear. And here's all the different part numbers that came out of the shear, and the amount of errors is all about the same for every part number. So it'd be a flat line. It's like, okay, maybe that's not what I should be looking at. Maybe I need to look at another process. Maybe I need to look at only aluminum. Look at it under some different categories and kind of sort it a little bit differently, until you see something more like that, something more of a high bar down to lower bar versus flat as a pancake. So process mapping. Now we've had some examples of process mapping where there's just like 3 boxes where it says, well, I start the process, I do some work, and then my process is done. So I've got 3 boxes. It really doesn't do a whole lot of good as far as handing it to somebody to tell them, here's how to do this process. There's not enough steps. And you don't want to go too micro of a level. So you want to make sure when you do a process map, it's enough to kind of describe the process to where somebody can follow it along and basically do the process. But also, if you're trying to identify where an error is happening, you want enough detail there where you can pick out one of those squares and say that's where the problem's at. It's right in that area. And then you've got something a little better to go dive into and use this. So in this instance, we've got the Sunbeam coffee maker model up there, and again, the reason we did this one, it was actual real process map that we used because we had a bunch of engineers that kept making coffee and forgetting to put the coffee pot under the spigot when they were done. They would do everything and then walk away and leave the coffee pot sitting in the drainer and press the button, walk away, and make a big 1 gallon puddle of hot coffee all across the floor in a small lunchroom. So we did a process map, and we did a crime scene map, and we did all kinds of poke-the-okes and everything with all these engineers, which really irritated the heck out of them, but my boss really enjoyed me torturing them. So crime scene mapping. Crime scene mapping is when you're documenting on a process map the number of issues that have happened. So if I had that process map as before, and we had the issue where place the coffee filter in the coffee basket was one of our issues, there'd be little red dots or a dot with a number, let's say 3 or 4, it's happened 3 or 4 times. So we would use this, turn this into a crime scene map by identifying with numbers how many times something's gone wrong within that process or within that step. So process map becomes a crime scene map when we put a number of dots or a number on each step, or you have a map of your cell or your work area and you've got numbers or little dots to be able to identify this is how many times something's gone wrong there. So in this map, most of our dots are on the grind process. So again, if I was going to go look at what's going on in that area, where am I going to go first? I can identify and say, well, I'm going to go look at what's going on in the grind area, because we've had that many issues there. So questions on any of that real quick? Pareto analysis, process mapping, versus a crime scene map. All pretty straightforward. Okay, we'll go into a little review of the second training, and this was on strategic planning. And now I know we had 1 or 2 that weren't here for the second one, John and you, and yeah, I was going to say we had a couple that weren't in the second one, so this will be a perfect review for you guys. So strat planning, and of course everyone kind of understands that strat planning is the organization's process of defining what its strategy or direction is. We've got a strat plan. I think here we call it the big, hairy, audacious goals, or BHAG. Thank you, BHAG. Every company's got strategic goals of some kind or another. Sometimes it's even just kind of a mission statement to say, hey, we're going to be better than everyone else. You know, that doesn't really help you along much. Does it measure you? If somebody said, hey, we're going to be better than everyone else, does that measure how you perform? Not really. It measures how the company might perform against other companies to say, hey, are we better than everyone else? But it doesn't measure the individual groups within a company. It's not really measuring, and measure drives behavior. So just like our kids, or as we were being brought up, you know, we were measured. We're measured on our grades in school. Our parents measured us on, did we do our homework? Did we do our chores? Did we get our allowance? So just like anything in life, measurement drives behavior. So that's what a strategic plan should do for a company if properly implemented. So within Lean, the process is called Hoshin, or Hoshin Planning. And what that means, basically translated, is everyone's pulling the oars in the same direction. Hoshin means compass, and Conry means same direction or working together. So what strategic plan does within Lean is a planning, but it's an implementation process which gives a direction to all levels of the organization. So everyone knows your part. So John, you would know, it's like, well, what I do here is related to this goal. And I would know what I do is related to that goal. And I get measured on how well I perform to that goal. Instead of everyone just kind of, I think I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I think I'm doing the right thing, but you really don't know. So this is an example of This is the S&P 500 from 1992. Kind of blurry on my screen up here. Yeah, 92. So from 1992 to 2011, this is the S&P 500 of some of the top companies. So Danaher has always performed extremely well regardless, which is Craftsman Tools, Jake Brake, Fluke Instruments, amongst the Crescent Wrench, a bunch of other companies like that, and where I came from. They started implementing a Hoshin process, which is instead of just having a basic strategic plan, is a Hoshin plan, which starts at the top and drives all the way down to the very last employee. They implemented it right there in 1998. So from that point forward, look what happened to their performance and their stock price from that point all the way up to 2011. And the president of that company will tell you the only reason they performed to that level was because of Hoshin. Because they have a strategic plan that drove all, I think there are 130 some odd companies now is under the Danaher umbrella, drove all of them exactly the same way to the same goals, every single one.
How do you spell that acronym?
Hoshin?
It's like the Hoshin.
H-O-S-H-I-N. Yeah. The Hoshin Planning. So that's when Hoshin was deployed. Just a coincidence, Brent started at Danaher at that time. I was the one that introduced Hoshin to them at that time. And that's when I left Danaher, and it kind of flattened out after that. No, it still continues to grow, but that is when that's my time span at Danaher right there.
Have we implemented this type of strategic plan?
Parts of it. Yeah. Right now our strategic plan is this 3 to 5 year plan, and then it stops. Yeah, it doesn't go any further than that. And this is kind of a evolutionary process to be able to throw a very detailed Hoshin plan out to an organization all in one lump sum would just overwhelm. So yeah, it's just kind of like every year you just go a little bit deeper into the different levels of company. And I'll kind of walk you through what that looks like. So a Hoshin plan starts with that, again, that 3 to 5 year vision of where you want to be. It drops down into a Kaizen Roadmap, and then it drops down into a bunch of different levels from there. But you always start at that 3 to 5 year level. Now it looks like this really complicated matrix, but it really is, you're not entering any information here anyways. This is just your view of it. Down below is where all the data gets entered. But basically you sit down, and at this point it's our senior team and our board of directors for us. We sit down and go, where do we want to be 3 to 5 years from now? And we say, well, we want OP to be at 4.5, that's operating profit of 4.5%. We want to be at 500 associates, which we're pretty dang close to that right now. We were at 495 yesterday. 500 associates, we want sales to be at 51 million, which we're already close. I think we're going to hit 70 this year, 70 million in sales. 12% increase in our aerospace business, and we want our Six Sigma with PPM as parts per million is 500. So a PPM is a way to measure quality. So PPM is if I made 10 million parts, I only want 500 rejects out of 10 million parts that I produced. So to be at a Six Sigma level, we would have to only have 500 errors leave the building at 10 million parts, which is probably about a year for us now. We're probably close to 10 million parts a year coming out of this building. So that's a pretty audacious BHAG goal right there, is to be at 500. So you develop that 3 to 5 year vision, and right now that's where we're at. We develop this vision and then we throw it out there and say, okay, everybody do those things. Well, what a Hoshin plan does is says, okay, great, I got my 3 to 5 year vision, but what does this year look like? So how do I take that 3 to 5 year vision and say, well, this year I'm not going to be at the 5 year vision, of course, but what does it look like this year? So this year we're going to strive for 3.2 operating profit, 425 people. We're hoping to hit 45 million in sales. We're going to increase the aerospace business not 12% but 6%, and we want our PPM to be less than 1,000. So again, it's just a piece or a step towards that 3 to 5 year goal. So you're breaking this up into more bite-sized pieces. So I've got my annual objectives now, and then I say, okay, out of those annual objectives, I may not be able to do everything. I may not have the resources at times to do it all. So give me priorities. So again, anything closest to the center or closest to the sun, as they call it, is my first priority. So I have those numbered going up this column, and it just says, hey, this is the things that I'm going to work on as my number one priority is increase the margin. I need to be more profitable, because that will go a long ways with other things that we want to do. I can't do a lot of those other things that I want to do unless I increase my margin. I can't hire more people. We can't do more training. We can't work on quality issues for new equipment and things unless I increase my margin. So I got my priorities in order. And then after that, I said, okay, what are my targets? How am I going to measure whether I'm successful? And that's the key piece to it, is we can have all these great goals, but how do I measure it? How do I hold people accountable to whether we're hitting targets or not? So you develop how you're going to measure each one of those things that you want to do. How we're adding employees is pretty easy to measure. We just count. Everyone holds still for a few minutes and we count heads and we come up with a number. So here's our target. This is the targets. So we're going to increase margins are easy to measure. Increase our inventory turns. We're looking at to have 5 Greenbelts awarded that year. So here's all of our targets and how we're going to measure them. And then that final piece is who owns it. So across the top, there's all these little X's and O's, and that's not hugs and kisses, by the way. But the little X's and O's up here, and down across the bottom, we have our resources. And those are the managers who are owners of those processes. So if we're gonna go back and say, well, complete lean training with all business unit managers was the goal. And I can go across the top over here and find my name. I go up and there's a little X up there with my name on it. Connected.
Can I ask, to the
Sure.
right of your box there, is that the targets to improve list?
This is targets to improve.
Okay.
Yes. So a 3 to 5 year annual objective, our improvement priorities, which ones I need to prioritize first, and then these are how I'm going to measure whether I'm hitting those things. And then the names over here, like I said, if you go up to, where's me? There's me. I go up and there's a couple X's up there with my name on them. So that means I own it. If there's
Then you go left from those X's.
Mm-hmm. So I go left and I go, oh, lean training scheduled for managers, I own. I go over here, there's an X that drops down, and it's like, oh, there's the annual objective that it relates to, and I go all the way down to that X, and it's all attached to the Six Sigma Quality Initiative. So I can go all the way, counterclockwise until I connect myself to the 3 to 5 year goal. So I know everything I do relates to that as far as the 3 to 5 year goal, and the annual objective, it relates to our lean introduced to the leadership is what that relates to, or the annual. So I can go, well, what am I doing today? I can look at this and go, it relates all the way back to here. So I know how everything I do is related to the master Hoshin Plan. So again, this looks like, oh, it'd be all this weird data entry or all these upside down and angles and X's and O's. All of this is actually entered down below. It's just a basic form that you're filling out down below, but the data is presented like this because this is what gets printed and everyone gets to hold and hang around and gets framed basically, because once this is established, it doesn't change. Very rarely does it change.
And then are there links up there?
Oh, there's links all the way through, yeah. All of this is a single Excel file with formulas and links built all over it. So no one's entering. I'll show you where we go quite a ways into it before anyone's entering data. It goes really deep before anyone's starting to actually touch anything. So this is an annual process. Down below this, you're entering or making some of this data, creating some of this information. It's all entered in a form down below, but it's presented this way.
And then how you met your targets is presented below as well.
It's presented in some of the next slides we'll look at. So this is a tab on a single Excel sheet, one tab. So again, resources, who owns it and who's assisting. So the next tab in the Hoshin Plan is the Kaizen Roadmap. So Kaizen Roadmap looks real similar to that master Hoshin Plan. What it's doing is just taking your annual objectives, because I don't need to plan Kaizen 3 to 5 years from now. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So my Kaizen Roadmap is, here's my annual objectives. Again, that's copied from the previous tab, so I'm not entering anything here. Here's my target to improve. Now, anything that's not hitting a target, I can schedule a Kaizen event. I can show the status of that Kaizen event. And again, I've got names down here from the previous sheet that says who the owner is. So what this does is help you prioritize your Kaizen events all around your Hoshin Plan. So anytime there's a gap in there that you say, hey, I don't have anything scheduled that's directly related to the Hoshin Plan, I can fit other events in there as needed. But at least this way you're able to say, hey, my calendar's full and everything relates to a Hoshin target of some kind. So I'm always driving my improvements towards what the strategic plan is. So again, the only thing I'm entering here is the Kaizen event, and then in the proper date, and then I'm just color coordinating up above to say, hey, it's completed, or it's in process, or it's behind in red. So green, yellow, and red. So that's the annual objectives and targets to improve is all transferred from the strat plan. And then, of course, the Kaizen schedules are based on your target to improve plan. And then dots show the relationship again. And then that just shows the status of the event, the green, yellow, red up above. So here's where we start looking at how am I doing. Once a month, we sit down and we look at this bowler. And again, this is the third tab over on the same Excel sheet. This is my how am I doing dashboard across the company. This is what we multiple companies. This sample actually is from Boxmaker. So at Boxmaker, we measure, of course, operating profit. Here, we're looking at measuring our aerospace and our non-aerospace business. We're looking at sales, safety, quality, both internal and external. We're looking at our on-time delivery, and we're looking at cost. So we were looking at how the number of credits, how often we had to give money back to the customer, which is really expensive, our waste cost, and then our inventory cost. So anytime we wanted to keep our inventory below 30-day average. So anytime we were above that number was red. So you're looking at a bunch of targets every month. There was a target to be met. If we didn't meet that target, when the data is entered, it turns red. If we were on target and we enter the data, it turns green. So when we go to sit down and do our monthly review, which we have one, we would pull this up. This is the first thing that gets thrown up on the screen, and we're looking at it, and the only thing we're talking about is the red squares for that month. Anything that's red. So in this instance, we'd be looking at our non-aerospace business and say, hey, we were, just a little bit below, about 400,000 below target. So what happened? So whoever was responsible for sales or manufacturing for that segment of business gets up and talks about it. He says, well, here's what happened, something unexpected. This is our corrective action. We're going to make up for it next month. something didn't ship on time, but we'll make up for it next month, and then we move on to the next red square. So if anything is green, we don't really need to talk about it. But is any of the data entered at this level? No. This is a dashboard review, which is an accumulation of a whole bunch of other spreadsheets out there.
What's this one called again?
This is what they call the top level bowler, and it's called a bowler because it kind of resembles a score sheet when you're bowling. Instead of this has 12 rows instead of 10, but the same idea. So green when you're on target, red when you're not, and that's just conditional formatting that's doing that. So below that top level bowler could be 1 or 2 more bowlers, or it could be 20. It just depends on the size of your business and how deep you want to measure. Now, for us to introduce this, or how it would get introduced to some companies, is you might have that top level bowler, and you might have 1 or 2 down below, and that's about it. And then you could slowly introduce more and more and more. So Michael Leifson might have a bowler, Eric might have a bowler, Spokane might have one for their operation. Early on, we'll probably stop about there. And then the next year or two, we would get down to Mike Shea level, and maybe even down to some of the leads having their own bowlers. So from the second level on down, we start getting into more of a Pareto analysis. So in this example, this is a KPI, which is a key performance indicator, and this is where the data gets entered. So if this was me, I'm measuring external quality, and I'm listing the data to say this is how many pieces shipped, this is how many got rejected, it's calculating the percentage of my quality rejects. And then over here, I'm saying of those rejects that I got returned, what were they? So we have defective product, we have design error, vendor error. So I'm categorizing what those are. And I've got 2 bar charts showing a cum of what's been going on with my quality return. And then I have my KPI down here, which has my actions. What am I doing? My corrective actions. So this page, single page that I'm entering this data, there's one of these for every line that you see running across that top level bowler. So for every safety problem, every quality issue, every sales issue that I'm tracking, there's a KPI for it. At least one. You could have multiple of them going on. So we might have this for Seattle and have one for Spokane, but they get summed up and they both appear on that top level bowler. But there's always at least one for every one of those lines. So I've got my tracking, I got my detail, and then I have to drop down at least enough to be able to break up a reason code, so I have some action. Because if I just look at this quality shipment versus reject, is it telling you what to go work on? Just kind of giving you a number, telling you what your percentage overall is doing, but it's really not pointing at any issue to go work on. So my next level down here, returns by reason code. Now I've got some information that I can go work on. And in this instance, this was actually corrugated division at Boxmaker back in 2010. One of our #1 reasons for returns was customer error. They were going on our website and ordering the wrong thing. Kind of a nice problem to have with the customers making the mistake and not you. But it came back to us, and we had to make a lot of corrections on our website to make it easier for a customer to place an order.
So that return by reason code, is it cumulative from January, February of the quality?
It could be that. You can make it to where it's month by month. What are your issues? But yeah, you're right. If this is a cum of the year, customer error might still be one of your highest marks, but you fixed the issue.
Right.
But it's going to remain high until averaging slowly takes over, and it might be 3 or 4 months until that bar drops off, even though you've corrected the issue. So you might need to look at that month by month versus
right.
looking at a cube. But then that last piece of it, again, this is all on the same sheet, is what are you doing about it? Who's, what happened? What are you doing? Who's doing it? When are they doing it? What's the target? What was the actual finish date? And this holds people accountable. At Boxmaker and a few other companies, the actions were actually hyperlinks to the corrective action in the network. So if you read that, it was blue underlined. And does everyone know hyperlinks are blue underlined? Okay. So, but I'll mention that in a few other places in here. I want to make sure you know when you see a blue underline, it's a hyperlink. That you could see that relocate balance of tooling to point of use. You could click on that and it would send you right to the corrective action that was written up and documented. That was another plus that we got from our ISO auditor, was not having to go, oh, I got to go look over here and see if I could find that NCR, because we could find every NCR this way. So that's a lot of information I threw at you guys. Are there any questions about how that works? And I have a sample one I can throw at you to go in there and play around with and add data and watch how it changes and relates everywhere else. But it's just a single Excel file, not all that big, but it's something to where all the data entry is being done down on the shop floor and not at the management level. Management level is the dashboard. They can just go and look and see what's going on, see what the issues are. But the expectation is the shop floor is entering the data and the shop floor is doing something about it. And management's just using that data to report how it's affecting the Hoshin plan. Yeah, Mark.
So what do you do after the 5 years? You start another one?
Oh, start another one. Yeah. And every year you do a review to say, hey, is anything, because market changes, new things come along. We started looking at medical as a good business to get into. So part of our Hoshin plan would have changed to maybe say, instead of saying non-aerospace business, we might change that to say, well, we want X% to be medical. We want to be $10 million into the medical business by 4 or 5 years from now. So every year you're going to do a review and say, is this still work, or do we need to, a slight course correction? It's not very often you're going to take a 90-degree turn every year. So that 3 to 5 year usually doesn't change that much. You're just doing a couple degree course correction over the year. But yeah, slight changes, pretty rare it's a radical change. If Boeing dumped us as a supplier, then that would probably do a pretty radical change.
So just a technical question. If the end users are updating that particular spreadsheet, is that right? They're opening up that one spreadsheet and making changes to it? And multiple people have it open at the same time?
Oh, depending on the type of, or how you're using Excel. If you're using just like a little personal version of Excel, yeah, one person at a time goes in. But when you're using enterprise level of Excel, I can have multiple people in the same file at the same time. I could go into it and say, oh, I'm going to add some data, and it would say, oh, Doris is working on this other tab over here, and yeah, Dorothy's over here. So it just lets me know. It's like, oh, I don't want to go in there, and I should never be typing over your data because you're the one that owns it. So I should never be in there anyways. And of course, with Excel, I can go in there and say the who column. John has access to that. Nobody else. So if you're not signed in to that computer as John, you're not getting access to any of his information. A lot of security that you can throw in there.
Yeah.
And even the new versions of Excel is the same as the enterprise version. So the Windows 365 version is I can see who's in there. I can share with anyone I want, and I don't even have to have the enterprise version anymore.
Like the 365.
I can go into this version that I've got right now, even the PowerPoint version we're looking at right now, and I can say you have access to read it, and John has access to go in and write to it, and no one else. So I can go and lock things down to that level.
So is that what you mean by the end user?
Yeah, and like say you, I mean, you'd be a perfect example, like you and Nelmar, this would be you. You'd be the one with, that would be you right there, entering all that data, weekly, monthly, where you're going in saying, hey, we shipped this many, say this was a KPI on the Camelback, the mollies, would be a good example. How many we shipped, how many we rejected. Of course, the percentage calculates for you. The charts, self-populate. But out of the rejects we had, what were they caused by? So you'd be entering that data. And so you just enter that data, close it, walk away.
So is this also tied to the NC database?
It can be. And like I said, as you can see the example down here, there's my blue highlighted link. So if I tried to click on that link right now, it would try to go into BoxMaker's system and read their NCR, but I'm pretty sure we don't have access to their servers right now. It would just give me a big error message. As you can see, the blue hyperlink down there, that was the link to that. You can see it's NCR number 1-11, and that was the corrective action for that process that failed.
When you're doing your 3 to 5 year strategic plan, and you're setting your numbered goals, is the conventional wisdom to set easier goals to meet numbers-wise?
Good
or
question.
do you want to set really difficult ones and just see how far you can get?
Stretch goals. Yeah, it's always known as a stretch goal. The easy goals is like, why bother? You want to stretch. Okay. And that's some of the changes. I think, Nelmar, you were just asking, like, how often do you look at it or change it? If you're hitting a goal green, like every month, and you're not breaking a sweat, then somebody didn't put enough of a stretch goal in. And that's something the senior level management or president or board of director level even should look at and say, okay, nice try. Nice try. You threw an easy goal in there. Or sometimes we're really going to struggle to hit this number on aerospace sales, and we land a big fat contract, and all of a sudden it's green from then on. It's like, well, time to go ahead and ratchet it up a little more, make it more of a stretch goal. Because what happens with a stretch goal is you start thinking outside the box, or you're a little more challenged, and you have to start thinking a little differently. And it should make you sweat a little bit when they come along and say, oh, well, your goal this year is to only have 1 reject a month. I mean, what would happen if the board of directors said, hey, we're going to start measuring this, and I only want to see one reject a month come out of this building? Besides a few heart attacks and people dropping over and whatnot, I mean, what would happen is, yeah, everybody would be having meetings and Kaizen's like crazy trying to figure out, how do we stop any rejects from leaving the building? So yeah, you're right, stretch goal. Yeah, very much. Past all my little arrows. And then our quick review on the third training, which again is a little bit about the 80-20 rule, the basic theory of the 80% controlled by the 20%. And with that, it's like if you look at management, money, inventory, everything kind of follows into that Pareto rule, that 80-20 rule. 20% of the employment or the employees at a company are managers. So, but they control 80% or more of the company. Money, most of the, 20% of the people in the country or in the world own 80% of the money. And then inventory is kind of the same. 80% of our money is only 20% of our parts that are out there. So it's a different way to look at inventory and measure and control inventory. So 80% of our volume of dollars is only from 20% of our parts. So again, when you look at inventory, most companies measure it all of these ways. Everyone that's listed up here, they look at quantity, of course, how many do I have? How many dollars do I have? How much space am I taking up? Volume, which is volume of dollars, or the flow of money. Turns, if anyone's familiar with inventory turns, is a real common way to measure inventory. which is how many times am I rebuying that part or rebuying inventory based on my sales. So basically you look at how much inventory do I have on the shelf and what's my annual sales, and just divide that and say, oh, it looks like I turn, so for us, I think we have 10 million in inventory. We're going to hit 70 million in sales, so we turn our inventory 7 times. Is the basic formula. World class would be 20 to 24 times. I've seen some that are just like maybe 2 or 3 turns a year, but that's basically a bunch of money sitting out there in the warehouse, so we're not doing anything with. It's just sitting. So if we looked at our inventory out there that way, is 20% of our inventory is moving a lot, 80% of it's just kind of sitting on its rear end, not doing a whole lot for us. So volume is in turns, and which is the amount of inventory divided by sales, a different way to look at it. Days on hand, another way to measure inventory is basically to say if we stopped buying parts right now, how long would it be until we ran out? How many days until we ran out? So if you run out of inventory in a week or so, then you're running pretty lean. You're actually doing pretty well. Toyota, they had a major power outage in the area where one of the factories was getting trucks delivered to it. 2 hours. They had 2 hours worth of inventory and the factory shut down because the trucks couldn't get to the plant. That's how tight it runs. 2 hours. The facility I came from in Southern Oregon, the cabinet factory, our Kanbans came to a halt when one of the processes shut down, our major processes shut down, and we came to a grinding halt in about 3 hours, whole factory, from that one department shutting down. So,
that's a good idea, though.
really, well, then you just focus on, I mean, in this instance, you're focusing on how do I make sure that doesn't happen? How do I correct that? Where in this instance, with that factory in Toyota, that was a once in 10-year issue that had happened. Our factory down in Southern Oregon, when that happened, we just had some redundant systems in place so that would never happen again. It was basically our paint room. So parts went in one piece at a time. They went through the process of getting stained and lacquered and dried, and then popped out the other end of the factory. And it was about a 2-hour process for that part to flow through and pop out the other end. So when that paint room shut down, when our air compressors shut down, that stopped. So everything just came to a grinding halt. So we just did backup systems and fired everything up, and we were off and going, never happened again. But what that does to you, reducing your lead time, that company was 3 weeks and a day from phone call to you getting your kitchen cabinets delivered in your driveway. When we were done 3 years later and got to that point of one piece flow all the way through, it was a day and a half from phone call to being in your driveway. 3 weeks in a day to a day and a half. If you called by noon today, by the end of the day tomorrow, they could be in your driveway. But there's a bunch of different ways to measure inventory. But again, the most effective way, using the 80-20 rule to manage your inventory, get the most bang for your buck, is by looking at volume. So volume is really a way to classify inventory. And so you're not looking at cost of the individual item. I don't care if something's 2 cents or $1,000 per part. So we look at it as far as actions, and we identify them as A, B, or C based on the volume of money or the flow of money going through that part number. So again, 80% of my volume is going to be classified as an A item, but it's only going to be 20% of my inventory items. So when we look at I think we have about 5,000 part numbers in the building, maybe a little more. I can manage 80% of my dollars by only looking closely at 20% of that inventory. Saves me a ton of time and effort, and I get biggest bang for my buck just tightly managing those A items. My B items are only 15% of my volume, but they're 30%, a full third of my part numbers. And half of my part numbers are C items, and they're only 5% of my volume. And those are usually nut and bolt and
Are the A items the most expensive items?
Not the most expensive, but the highest volume. So an A item, and I'll show you an example here in a second, an A item can be 2 cents. But we buy hundreds of thousands of those things every week. We're just tons of them coming in and going out. So do I manage a big chunk of money by really closely looking at how tight my delivery schedule is and only getting just the right amount I need? So that money is almost like virtually never on the books. It comes in the building, we receive it, and it turns around and goes right out again. So I can manage a good chunk of my money doing that versus calling and saying, oh, it's a 2 cent item, I'm going to classify it as a C because it's cheap and I'm just going to have gaylords of it all over the place and not think much about it. So the way business works and the way banking and taxes work is it goes off the volume of dollars versus how much you're actually paying for an individual item. So the way you would do an ABC analysis is you have a list of part numbers, you determine the quantity that you've used over a period of time, and then get the cost for each item, and then just multiply that out. Then you're going to sort it from high to low, and then you're going to calculate the percent of usage for each item, and I'll show you that again on the spreadsheet. And then select that percentage cutoff. So you're going to go down the column until you hit 80% of your total, draw a line, and everything above that you flag it as an A, and on down. Most inventory systems, not ours, but most out there in the world do the ABC analysis and classification for you and constantly update on its own. So you don't ever have to think about it. You just run a report and say, show me my A items, and it prints out a report. So here's how I'm building this ABC analysis. So I have a list of part numbers. This is a real example from good old box maker from 2011. So I had 2,756 part numbers, really not that many, so it's pretty easy to manage. So I have part number, description, the quantity, which is how many I sold that year, what the individual cost was. So those two get multiplied and I end up with my volume of dollars. So this is already sorted from high to low based on my volume of dollars. So I have an item, number one item, it's 57 bucks. It's not actually cheap. We sold almost 2,000 of them, so there's 100 grand in volume of money flowing through the building. So the third item on my list, third highest volume of dollars, was 48 cents each. But it was over $70,000 in volume of business. So I would total this up until I got to 80% of the overall total, draw a line, and everything above that is an A item. So quantity times cost equals my volume. So here it is expanded out a little bit. Now I've got a column that's got my A, B, and C items, and I've condensed this down. But up here, I'm looking at my A items, is $4.7 million of my inventory, is 80% of my dollars, but I've only got, it's only 17% of my part numbers. I'm actually a little under the 80-20 rule. So it's quite a bit of dollars of inventory I can manage. Out of my 5.8 million total, I can manage 4.7 million of it and only worry about 17% of my part numbers. So the actions on that 17% would be, I'm going to watch those like a hawk. We're going to really look at reducing our lead times with vendors. I'm going to make sure I don't have too many or too little that hurt my business, because that's obviously a high flowing item. So I want to make sure I've got really good relationships with those vendors to make sure I've got reduced lead time. And I'm always working with my customers, make sure I don't get stuck with anything. Because once that river or that pipeline starts flowing, just like a train, once that train gets moving, and that customer all of a sudden at $100,000 volume a year says, oh, I'm switching over to something else, and you're trying to halt that train, and yeah, you're going to get stuck with a whole bunch of inventory, and you usually have to buy up the pipeline that's coming in behind you. So you're just completely different actions for A items. But this is what that analysis overall would look like. So I've got ABCs, I've got my number breakdowns, I have my percentages, and then of course in the case of this particular spreadsheet, every time any of these numbers change and it reclassifies a part, the A, B, and C will change for me automatically. It'll look to see where it's at and move it to a different spot and then change the classification for me. So there's, again, a little blow up of it. 17%, 25% of my inventory is B's, and then C's are 57% of the inventory. And real small volume of over half, almost 60% of my inventory was less than 300,000 out of 5.8 million. And that was, at the time they were a $50 million company. So a little less than 10 turns a year, which is pretty good. It wasn't bad at all for them. So 80, 15, and 5. So any questions on that? I mean, it's a lot big analysis going on there, but it's just, again, just taking that 80-20 rule and just kind of sorting things out a little bit to where it tells you what's the important thing to go work on.
Hey, Brad.
Yeah.
So how often should you do an ABC analysis? Is that a yearly thing, or because you know you might have different seasons?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, some businesses are what they call cyclical. We do have ups and downs here a little bit. Certain times a year, certain things are hot, and some years they're not. So yeah, that would depend on the business. It wouldn't hurt to do it monthly, because once you build it, once you have the analysis, it's just a simple download out of the system that you're just going to repopulate a couple columns. You might even automate it, and then once you've got that done, you just once a month you're looking at it, and you can actually program your Excel sheet to say, hey, these 3 items changed classifications this month, so you can have those flagged and just say everything else stayed the same, didn't change, but these 3 things did. But yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, some businesses are very cyclical. We did box maker, was crazy up and down cycles. Around September was our Christmas. So everybody that was manufacturing things for Christmas was ordering packaging in September. So September, October, we were just crazy busy doing all kinds of Christmas packaging. And then it would cut off about late October. And then orders would just pew after that. Then in January, it would start picking up again. It's always kind of slow around Christmas time because everyone's already ordered all their Christmas packaging and got super busy. So yeah, we ran that constantly over there. Or we knew it's like, okay, things are starting to slow down, run it again. It's like, oh, things are picking up, run it again. So PQPR analysis, which is part quantity, part routing, real similar to an ABC analysis. But what a part quantity, part routing analysis looks at is the volume of the process or the cell or the work area of how much business is flowing through or how much work is flowing through that area. So again, I can look at a PQPR analysis and say, out of all of my parts that I work on here, which ones belong where based on like steps. So I don't want to take a part that's made out of fiberglass and throw it into a cell that John works in that's working with aluminum, because it just doesn't make any sense. But I can do, with a PQPR analysis, I can look at all my different processes in the building and say, hey, this new part came in that we're going to make for Boeing. Where does it make the most sense to throw this part into? And I can look at that and say, well, this part has this like processes, so it makes more sense to give it to that group. So again, it looks real similar to a ABC analysis. I've got a part number, I've got my demand over time, but this is my demand of what I make versus what I'm buying. And then it tells me what the overall percentage of my volume is. So in this little example, as soon as I fill out the column of my demand quantity, it calculates the percentages for me and sorts it from high to low for me. So there's my part number. I make $350 a year, and based on all my other quantities in this example, that's 35% of my business right there is that part number. So across the top, I have CNC, lathe, grind, roll, deburr, all the different processes that I have in the building. So I'm going to take my part number demand percentage and I start documenting what the steps are for each part. So that first part number 1, 2, 3, 4, goes from CNC, lathe, grind, goes to deburr, assembly, and then out the door to packaging. So I do that for every part. And I have all these columns filled up with steps 1, 2, 3, 4 in the order that they're used. And sometimes it skips over one and goes back one, but that's what you want to identify. So when you're all done, you've got all these little lines and circles around each part number and each step. So I can look at that and say, well, if I was going to build a cell and group a bunch of machines together in this sample, which ones would what part numbers would I throw at the first cell? Or how would I build that first cell? So I got my first 3 part numbers, which are a huge chunk of my business. I'm going to build a cell with a CNC, a lathe, a grind, deburr, and then assembly and packaging process, all in that order, because the biggest chunk of my business, almost the entire amount of my business, goes through that process right there. And a few others are close, but not quite. I've got some really small percentages that go through a roll process, and I've got 2 of them that go through a tooth cutting process. So those 2 steps I could have off to the side, or I could have those in a separate cell. So it goes through, once it's done with grind, the couple of these down here could go off to that other little secondary cell and then come back. So I don't want to put those processes in there because most of the time I wouldn't use them with the biggest chunk of my business. So this kind of helps you figure out what machines do I put next to each other, or a new part came along and I can go in and say, well, it goes from here to here to here to here, and I would say, okay, do I need to make a new cell for it? What's the percentage of my business? If it became, a higher percentage is this than my business, higher than that 35%, maybe it's time for me to redo this cell a little bit and squeeze a new piece of equipment in between and just skip it from time to time. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what's my volume on my processes, where are my strains at, and where do I lay out my equipment to where, for the most part, I get the best flow possible running through the building. This is usually a pretty easy analysis to do on the left-hand side. It's the right-hand side that's pretty arduous. It gets pretty tough having to sit down there for part and have somebody identify every single process and which step does it go through. So, questions on that PQPR? Okay, if you come up with one, you can just ask. Again, a little bit on Six Sigma bell curve and some different analyses within Six Sigma. Do we remember what mean is? Mean's another word for average. Is that average? Mode is the number that's most often, pops up most often. And then median is the middle of a bunch of numbers, not the average, but just what the middle value is. So mean is the average, median is out of all the numbers, which one's kind of in the middle. And then there's range, which we've talked about, and we'll do range here again in a minute. And then standard deviation. So again, mean, mode, and median are single numbers that kind of help describe how data is distributed. And then knowing how the data is distributed kind of helps you on where to go or where a problem might exist. So again, here's that little example of the height of North American men. And we have the average, which is our mean, or our average here in the center, which I think came out to 69, I think it was around 69 inches was like the average height of North American men. So this contains mean, range, and standard deviation in a bell curve. So mean is that red line in the center telling me what my average is. The range, which is from one end of the bell curve to the other, that means my range of data goes from left to right. And the standard deviation is from the mean, from the center. I've got 3 standard deviations to the left, 3 standard deviations to the right. Or I have a standard deviation also known as a sigma. So where the name Six Sigma came from is within every standard process or within every range of data, you have 3 sigmas to the right, 3 sigmas to the left, you have 6 sigmas. So that's where the name Six Sigma came from. So why is that important to know, what those sigmas are or what those standard deviations are? It's just a way to help divvy up the data to where you can look at it and look at each segment to see what's going on within that segment. So we'll kind of walk through, how that's done. So there's my mean or my average in the center, my range, which is my width of data. So like when we were doing the catapult and you had you hit target, you were like at 1 or 1 inch from the target, and you had a miss of like 30 inches. So the range is that smaller number subtracted from the larger number, and that's your range of data. And then again, standard deviation. So we'll get into what that deviation is. So again, mean is just an average. You add up all the numbers that you have. You divide it by how many there are. So in this case, I've got this adds up to 35. I have 6 numbers. That gives me an average or a mean of 5.8. That's real common to do. Averages, unless you've got lots of data, can be kind of dangerous. Doing an average on 6 numbers can be really dangerous. And I would go back to that. If I had a 1-inch rope and a thread and I tie them together and throw them over the cliff to rescue you and tell you, don't worry, it averages out to half an inch, it doesn't do it. It's not really that good of information. And then I've got mode, which is my most often. So I have a range of numbers. I put them in order just to make it a little easier. And out of all of those numbers, which one shows up most often? So I got 3 15s that popped in there. So 15 is my mode just because it happened most often. And then median or middle value of the data is where I can again total up all that data and just look at what's in the middle. So if I've got 6 numbers again, and I line my numbers up in order, and it's a little more difficult to do when you've got an even number. So with an odd number, if I lined up all my numbers in order, I can say, well, out of all those numbers, my middle value is 15. So it's real easy to do when you got an odd number. With an even number, I would take the 2 in the middle, add them together, and just divide them in 2 and get that middle value. So it's not an average, but it's just where, out of all the numbers that I've got, which one's smack dab in the middle. So again, if I'm looking at that same group of numbers over here, but if I look at the mean, I'm sitting at 21.5. If I look at the mode, I'm at 16. If I'm looking at the median, I'm at 20. So I get different numbers depending on how I look at the same amount of data. Same range of data, but I've got 3 different numbers telling me 3 different things. So depending on the analysis that you're doing, each one of those can point you in a different direction. Just depends. Most everyone just jumps right into mean and says, oh, my average is this. Well, that average can be throwing you off because you've got a bunch of really low numbers or a large group of higher numbers or some anomaly. So the mode and the median can kind of help guide you to say, well, if all three of those come out to about the same number, then you know your average or your mean is probably okay, because it sounds like you've got a good spread of data. But when they're radically different like this, when your mode is 16 and your mean is 21, then yeah, you've got something else going on in there that you may not want to depend on that mean as a number. So average, most often, and middle. So again, range. We talked about range a little bit before. We actually used range with the catapults. So we just said, hey, out of that spread of data, what is my range? Taking my smallest number, subtracting it from the largest number, and say, well, if my highest is 17, my smallest is 3, so my data range is 14. So my spread is 14. So the reason that's important is when most companies, and even us, when we say min-max, we're always talking about standards, and it's like, well, the part needs to be 11 inches plus or minus, 10,000th or whatever that, whatever the customer says it needs to be. So for us, we would look at it and say, well, we would look at the quality history on that part and say, well, how often are we below and how often are we above, where we might be within customer specification, but we would want to know, well, what's the range? Is our range really narrow? Because if it is, if it's narrow around the middle, around the mode, then, hey, we're doing all right. That's a fairly stable process. But if it's ranging all over the place and it's bouncing back and forth off the min and the max all the time, then it's kind of telling you you've got kind of an out-of-control process. So good old standard deviation. This one's hard to describe, but a standard deviation is just another measure of how spread out your numbers are. So again, you can have range spread out and the numbers are kind of up and down, but it kind of gives you an idea about how far it's spread out. What a standard deviation does is takes that range and divvies it up into 6 segments and puts 3 to one side, 3 to the other side, with your average or your mean right down the center. So it kind of gives you an idea of statistically when there is a change from my average, how much of a change is it? So square root of the variance, and it's like, say what? What's, it's talking about square root of the variance here. Here's a different way to look at it. So I'm going to use dogs. So to work out the mean, real simple, I'm going to measure all the heights of all these dogs. And so I got all my friends together. We're all going to measure how tall our dogs are at the shoulders. So we measured all the dogs at the shoulders, came up with their heights. We added them all together and divided by 5, because there's 5 dogs. And we came up with our average or our mean height of 394 millimeters. So now I want to look at the variance. So we calculate each dog's height difference from the mean or the average, and we add those all up after we do a square root, which square is when you multiply by itself. So if I take the 206, which is the difference from the average to that tallest dog over there, that big old Rottweiler, he was 206 centimeters from the average. I take the 206 times 206 and square it, I come up with that 42,000 number. So I did that with every dog. Their difference from the mean, came up with that number. And then I add it together, divide it by 5, because I got 5 puppies. I end up with a number that when I get to the square root of that number, I'm at 147 millimeters. So what the variance or the sigma tells me is based on every dog, based off that median or that average, when a dog does come in at a different height, statistically, it's going to centimeters from the average. And the next dog that comes in a little bit taller is going to be outside of that range. So if if all the dogs are averaging at that close to that 400 number, anytime the dogs range outside of that 147 range plus or minus, I've got an exception. It's like, well, that dog's either super tall or super short because they're outside of my sigma range now. So again, I'm looking at a process out here in machining, and they've been on average hitting right at whatever that number is, what I want them to hit. If I look at standard deviation and say, wow, well, as long as they're within 147 plus or minus, it looks like I have a stable process, I'm okay. Anytime it starts wandering outside that range, it's telling me something radically changed. Because historically, I've been in here. Anytime I'm outside of that, something weird happened. So, but again, nice thing with Excel, do I have to type in all that stuff into a formula? No, I just type in STD, DEV, and it does all of the calculating for me and draws you a nice bell curve and tells you all this cool information over here. So I don't, some of you might get into some analysis using standard deviation. Some of the information I might throw at you to build kind of tell me what the standard deviation is on a process. And of course, all of your projects I'll be working with you on one-on-one anyway, so I don't expect you to like throw this data at you and just have you do it. But that would be a really good one to do with some of the processes that we have here, to be able to pull some history down and say, well, here's what we've measured, not necessarily NCR data, but be able to pull down some data and say, well, 11 inches is where we're supposed to be, and we can be plus or minus 10,000, and here's where we actually landed, and be able to do a sigma analysis on that and say, well, our history says we end up to the right of where we're supposed to be more often than the left. So what's going on there? Or over a short period of time, we watched it slowly drift to the right and then stop. So something's moving or something's changing. So by looking at that standard deviation, it tells you as soon as something goes beyond a certain border statistically, red flags should go up. For right now, when does red flag go up? Yeah, it goes up when you find it. You're like, hey, this is bad. You know, it's beyond the 10,000. Well, a sigma analysis would say, well, actually, once it starts traveling past this certain point, a red or a yellow flag should go up to say, hey, you've gone beyond a certain point, and historically, it's going to be a short matter of time before it goes into the red. So that's what a good sigma analysis or deviation analysis will tell you. Historically, but it'll help you figure out when a red flag should go up. And ranked pairs. We did a little bit with ranked pairs analysis when we were doing the catapults before. And again, this is to assist in reaching a team agreement on things. So it kind of helps identify items. Sometimes they're hidden by similar priorities. And it really is just a way to you just create a chart, describe which items that pair up with each other, and then you vote. So again, we were talking about coffee before. And there we go, black that out. So again, it's an Excel spreadsheet, and you simply go in and say, well, here's the things that affect the taste of the coffee, and you repeat them across the top. And of course, as soon as you do that, the analysis blanks out the ones that don't make any sense. So when you're trying to pair up coffee type and coffee type, it doesn't make any sense, so the analysis will block those out. So what you do at that point is go in and say, well, of coffee type and coffee brand, which one's more important to what I think? So each person in the group would have one of these and would go in and cast your vote, basically. You know, who do I kick off the island? So you go in and you cast your vote all the way through. And say, well, which one do I pick? So each person would do that, and when it's all said and done, your votes get tallied up, your votes get tallied up and actually get thrown onto a good old bar chart. So you can say, well, out of everyone's votes, I've actually had the highest number of votes were for number 4. And number 4 is coffee storage conditions, as I'm saying that's the group is saying they casted the most votes, saying that's most important. So that's the first thing we're going to go work on. And the reason you do so much of this kind of like voting and things is, for the most part, when people are brainstorming or trying to make decisions, again, back to that Pareto rule, 20% of the room is making the decision for 80%, because 80% will kind of sit there and be quiet and have great ideas, but I don't want to say it, I don't want to raise my hand, I just kind of want to sit here and be quiet. This actually gives you an opportunity to go up and literally go to the voting booth and place your vote, and then go sit down, and the next person goes up and can place their votes and go sit down. So there's a tab for each person, and then it cums it all together. Because some people just don't. It's like, I have real strong opinions that it's coffee age, and I got shouted down before, and so I'm real uncomfortable raising my hand. So this helps get the ideas or get the thoughts out of the group without anybody feeling like they're being pressured. And then good old catapults. Because then I've said this before, somebody told me this was my quote, so there's no better way to learn about Six Sigma tools than with a catapult. So we're going to play around with the catapult again just real quick, but here's what I want you guys to do. Is we're going to do just as one single group, but we'll do 10 shots with the single group. We'll do the same thing we did before, is I want you to mark it, measure, we'll track the range, how far off the target we were each time. And then I'm going to have you guys go through 2 tools. So once you review all your inputs that you think affect the output after your shot, the goal is going to be the same. I want to see the range reduced by 50%. So you're going to review all the possible inputs that affect the output, and you're going to put them on this C&E diagram, on this fishbone. So I got little post-it notes out here on the table, but just as a group, I want you guys to write down ideas and say, I think this affects, I think this affects, and then I got categories on here. So it's method, how you're doing it. It's the machine itself. Man, which is the person, what is the person doing that could be affecting the output, and then measure. Maybe it's how we're measuring affects the output, which is the output being am I on target. So our effect is, hey, I'm out of range of the target. So I'm missing the target. I've got a circle drawn on the target. So anything that's out of range. So there's my effect. Here's my possible cause categories. So that's what I'll have you guys do, is shoot, come up with the things that you think affected the output, post them up here, and then we're going to jump onto this input-output tool and have you guys select your actions. We're going to list them on that tool. And what that tool is going to help us do, again, is categorize what you're going to work on. So once we put that in the tool, and you guys, again, are going to vote. So it's similar to the ranked pairs, but this is more of a group activity. You guys are going to shout numbers out to me. I'm going to load them in the sheet, and it's going to tell us which ones are more important. So I'm going to have you guys do the one, whatever one you classify or the sheet classifies as most important. You'll make that one correction, and then I'll have you do your 10 shots again and see how that improves for you. As soon as you're done shooting, I'm going to have you guys do this C&E using the post-it notes, and you've got categories up here, and you're just going to either talk amongst yourselves, somebody write them down, or multiple of you write them down, and then you say, well, that fits under this category, and then come up here and post them. So I think you guys got a couple really good thoughts up here on how to, how am I going to lock this thing down to be a lot more accurate, or at least decrease my range by 50%. So when we look at it and say, well, I want you guys to identify 4 actions. What are 4 things that we can do real quick out of the 6 or more that you've got going? Is what's really difficult for a lot of teams to do is to say, well, no, I think it should be this, I think it should be that. So a tool that I'd like you guys to try to use is what I have up here on the screen now. This is a sample, of an input-output matrix. So number one, you're identifying those critical to quality outputs, or in this case, critical to hitting my target. So here we're looking at a sample of coffee. So my outputs are the things that are important to me or as a customer is taste, aroma, and the acidity. So I've got all my inputs, which is my brand and type and age and how I store my coffee. So what I'm doing is scoring them based on how important I think they are to the output. So coffee brand, I'm saying, well, my taste is a 10. 10's my most important thing out of 1 to 10, 10 being coffee taste is critically important. So I'm saying coffee brand is a 6 out of 10 as far as how do I think it affects taste. So then I'm saying it's 2 to aroma, but it's an 8 on acidity. So coffee brand has a pretty high score based on the effect of acidity. And then what the analysis does for me is it ranks and gives me the percentage of the rank. So once you go through all of this and we say, okay, what are we going to go work on? Well, the thing that scored the highest was roasting method. So I got 164 score on my rank, 22% is saying it's roasting method. So once this is said and done, it's like that's the first thing I'm going to go work on or try to correct or look for something better because that scored the highest. So that same analysis I've got for you guys, a live one. So we're switching over to Excel now. So this is what the live analysis looks like. You can print, view results, view the instructions by clicking some buttons. Delete data, you can fill this with demo data if you're curious how it works. Click a button and it just fills it full of demo data. Or delete all, so I don't want to do any of those because we're going to use this. But what I have in here is in range, is an output variable. I don't want it to slide and I don't want it to bounce. I want it to plop and stick to the target. So if I'm looking at all these things that you guys are going to work on, I've got rubber band, amount, pullback distance, placement of the astronaut, stability, placement of the catapult, which again, I was just guessing at some of the things you guys might come up with. Which ones did I miss? I was just guessing, and I think I came up with most of what you guys were looking at.
Well, the last time we did it, those were our issues.
Oh.
We hadn't standardized from the
Yeah.
get-go the placement of the catapult.
Oh, same beanbag.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are astronauts.
Standardized measurement techniques.
Oh, standard. Yeah, placement. Yeah, so I have placement of, well, I have placement of astronaut actually, and stability of catapult, pullback distance. Yeah, placement of catapult. So it's like where and how. So I think that we have standardizing the method, which is pullback amount, the amount of rubber band, excuse me, pullback distance. Okay, so of the top 3 outputs, which one's the most important? And how important, if I'm going to say 1 to 10, how important is being in range? Okay. And how important is no slide? About a 6, you think? And
Measuring based on the slide, just as right, we measure where it hits.
First one.
yeah, measure where it hits.
It should be lower than 6, I would feel. It's not an issue.
Yeah.
But how much does it affect your measuring? Does it make measuring more? How important is that to you as the people doing the measure? Okay. You throw a 2. And how about bouncing? Having it like boom, boom, and then, okay, give it a 2. Okay. So now we can go in and start throwing the score in and say, okay, as far as how it affects range, so we got two things that are tied at 100, which is the pullback distance and using the same astronaut, both scored exactly the same. Now we could go through the, here's any of these things, how do they affect the no sliding, and how do they affect not having it bounce too much. But since those numbers are so low, they're from 10 to 2 and 2, you're going to maybe see one pull slightly ahead of the other, but because of the way that's laid out, we probably aren't going to see the data change at all. So since we have two things that are tied, and the next one 80% being the amount of rubber bands, let's work on pullback distance and using the same astronaut. So take a few minutes to pick your astronaut, come up with your pullback distance, and then let's do everyone take a shot again and see what we come up with. So we had one anomaly out of that run, but out of the 6 shots, he had one that was at 26. The rest of them were, if we took a look at those, we took that 26 out of there, you're actually, so we went from 4 as your lowest, 12 would have been your highest. So that would have been dropping your range from 24 to 8 if it wasn't for that one anomaly.
Right.
So again, when I was cautioning about if now we looked at this and said, well, what's my mode, what's my median, and then what's my mean or the average, we would run the average and say, oh, well, from 4 to 26, and here was our average. But then if we went again looked at it differently and said, well, wait a minute, between our mode, median, our numbers are just crazy different. So something went on. So you would look at that and say, well, I had one crazy number of 26. Something happened. So what does it look like when I remove that one?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden your range goes from, what, 22 to 8.
To 8.
Yeah. So.
Because you wouldn't have taken out the 26, you would have taken out the 12.
Yeah, we would have used the 12 instead of the 26.
Yeah.
But again, that's the importance of, it's like, well, I look at here's my range. Well, my range, I did all these things, I did these two things that we said were ranked at 100, so there were 20% of effect on each one, so I should have improved radically. I only improved a little bit, but if you looked at your median and your mode, you started looking at some of those numbers in different ways, you would say, oh, well, my data spread out all over the place. What happened? Oh, if I take that one anomaly out,
right,
everything falls into line. So again, that's that caution of, how do you look at numbers, or how do you do that reporting or analysis to not, put yourself in a bad way. Because if you looked at that and say, oh, we failed, we still got to keep crunching away at something, well, you just had one thing that threw you way off.
Yes, you did not fail.
Yeah, you didn't fail at all. So, so let's go to view results. So we'll click on our view results button, and there we go. So here's showing our output variables, our input characteristics, how they were ranked, and then we're looking at, here's our pullback distance that we worked on, and using the same astronaut that we worked on. And so this again would be our little chart to say, well, here's what we're going to go work on. So if we were going to work on one more thing, what would it be? Looks like the next highest scoring item was rubber band amount. So we would have jumped, that would have been the next thing to look at, is like, how many rubber bands? Do we do lighter, fewer rubber bands and just get closer? Or do I throw more powerful rubber bands on it and go further out? So I have less bounce and less slide, or, so that would have been your next thing, since that was your next high scoring item. Then we had two others that scored exactly the same as well, which was stability and placement of the catapult. But that's how this analysis would work. Then we can go back to view data, go back where we were. So again, I can share this with you guys, give you guys the electronic version of this. And there's, you just clear it out in one click. You can look at some demo data to play around with it and see how it works. And then you can just clear it out altogether, but not have to go in there and delete. So.
Well, thank you for attending, and if you have any questions or comments, you can reach me at the address below.